Hello, hello. Welcome to Unschooled Theology. We are back today. I am your host, Derick, and with me I have Evan. And Evan is actually going to set us up, I think, with a little bit of a review of what we talked about last time, which sets up where we go this time with a closer look at just exactly how the Bible is telling a story, and then what key part of that story of all of creation is missing, and that is the part that we play. So have at it, sir. A quick review for us.
Excellent. So yeah, we kind of, at the end of our conversation last week, we kind of drifted off into talking about the Bible as a story. And I was talking about how it is very significant that we're introduced from Genesis to the early parts of most of Exodus are all primarily story-based, and toying with the possibility of a counterfactual where God could have presented it just a list of material truths to begin, which probably would have satisfied a whole lot of evolutionists out there, or not, I don't know. Or they could have presented a list of functional truths as he does in the law later on. But it starts off with story, and so that lens is very important for when we are approaching the Bible. So today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the broader story of the Bible, so a bit of a 10,000-foot view of it, so that can help inform our conversations as we go forward. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Derick, just kind of starting off with what's the whole story of the Bible, I guess in 30 seconds.
Well, no, the point you make about bringing up the law and those kind of things later, I think that's important to consider when we think about the idea of stories that we've read. We'll read stories where it may be necessary at some point to understand technical details about how a world is structured. This is something I think we see in fantasy quite a bit. There's some science fiction as well. But if you look at, let's take the Lord of the Rings as an example, right? There are passages in the Lord of the Rings where it is dry descriptions of how the hierarchies work, how governments work, or those kind of things. Or in other stories, you might see descriptions of how trade and economies work. If you go Count of Monte Cristo, there's long sections that describe sort of the mechanisms behind the revenge being sought by our main character.
I'll give one more example just to flesh it out. Oscar Wilde, Picture of Dorian Gray. There's a long passage where he just lists off the extravagances of the main character, and these were things that were probably very familiar to people in his day. They were, to the modern reader, not always interpretable. References to particular types of clothing or wall decorations and things like that. And it was dull to read, but it functioned in the story as being an illustration of the extravagance of the character. So the material things that were being illustrated and were ad nauseum being described were functioning within the context of the story. So I think that
right
connects with what you're talking about.
And those things don't happen at the beginning of the story, right? Correct. They happen a little ways in as they set up more that goes on down the line. And I bring that up and mention all that just to say this is sort of evidence of, or an example of, why it is reasonable to think of the Bible as a whole, as a story. There's one of the elements of story that we see, the necessity of technical mechanistic detail thrown in, definitely not at the beginning, because that makes for a pretty dull start to a story, but it's in there, pretty early on to help set the table. And so that's one of the things we see in the Bible, looking at the Bible as a whole, as a story, is we see those components.
If we're going to talk about a hook too, I mean, the Bible should be a fantastic hook. In the beginning, God created. Like, that should be, every human should be kind of respond to that as like, okay, I want to know more. Right. In the beginning, the very origin of reality, God, the highest most being, made reality. Yes. And so we're sitting there going like, okay, wow, that should pull in an audience completely, and I guess it should be viewed.
Yeah, as far as famous first lines of books and whatnot.
Exactly.
So yeah, and we'll get to that then. So if we're looking at the Bible as a story as a whole, what we see right there, Genesis 1, is a setting of the scene, right? One thing you want to do early in a story is stage that things are not going as they were planned. And so what we see in Genesis 1 is the idea that there is a plan. And then immediately after that, we see in Genesis 2 and 3, things have gone off the rails from the plan, right? And so that is what we find in these first stories. This is what is set early on in the Bible, is the setting of the conflict, right? The setting of the what needs to be eventually resolved within this story. So we get a quick sort of setting the scene of what is meant to operate in this world, how things are meant to be done. And that is, and like you're saying, right? So a lot of stories will actually start with there being some sort of conflict, where like in the conflict and within the conflict. But there are stories, I think, that where the setting itself is such a grand thing and such an overwhelming thing that you can begin with the setting, actually. And you can begin with things working properly if the idea of things working properly and within order is so grand and so amazing that this is where we start our story, you know? And so that is what we see in the Bible here, is that idea. Here's this grand setting of things working correctly. We go to the story of Adam and Eve and we see it falling apart, right? And it continues to fall apart all the way through. You could go to the flood, you could go to the Tower of Babel, wherever you want to go, but we see this spiraling downwards, if you will, of the plan, of leaving the plan, and things just getting worse and worse and worse. And that is what the whole Old Testament really ends up becoming. Is it ends up becoming an examination of the problem in this story, an examination of the effects of having gone off the plan, the way in which that has destroyed really every fundamental aspect of human existence. They are all explored throughout the whole Old Testament. In particular, in Genesis, it starts with the family and shows the way it really disrupts the family dynamic. And then the rest of the Old Testament focuses a lot on the national, the idea of being a part of a nation, a part of a group, a part of larger communities, the way in which the sin, the going off the plan, has disrupted that thing. So that is what we get. But in the Old Testament, we see brief moments, if you will, of sort of returning to the plan, right? Getting back on the right train tracks. And it's these things that are a foreshadowing of the actual solution, right? The way this problem is going to be eventually solved. And then we get to the New Testament, where we have the person of Jesus, who, because we now have such a deep understanding of the problem, thanks to the Old Testament. This is why modern Christians, I think we overlook the Old Testament sometimes. And really, you can't fully appreciate the person of Jesus until you really understand what the Old Testament is saying, because you see such incredible depravity and such a loss of hope, while at the same time knowing what the solution would look like. That then when you see Jesus, it stands out all the more. It becomes a more impressive moment in the story of the Bible. And in Jesus, we see the solution, the ultimate solution, but more importantly, we see like tools, if you will, that get us there. This is what the Sermon on the Mount is. It's a lot of tools. It's a lot of approaches, ways to handle things. It's instructions, if you will, about how to reach the ultimate destination. And it's not that you are capable of bringing forth the conclusion of this. It is our hero of this story. It is Jesus who brings forth the ultimate conclusion. But you still have a part to play in that story. And that is what Jesus describes throughout his time in the gospel. Jesus is describing for us, among other things, but a significant part of it is, here's the role you're meant to play. Here's what you're meant to do. Here's the tools in your tool bag for fulfilling this role of yours. And which ultimately goes back to fulfilling the role that God sets forth in Genesis 1. But now doing so more fulfilled. And then in the Bible, we see Revelation. We get the end of the story, which is interesting. We get the conclusion. We get how this will all come to a good, happy ending at the end. And it's interesting that if we look at this, then there is one part missing for sure in this story. And that is that part between Jesus giving you the tools and giving you the instructions and giving you everything you need to play your part, and that final end of the story in Revelation. And so that is, when we look at the story of creation as a whole, in the Bible, we see an outline, a very detailed outline of it, but we still see that there's something missing, and that is where we come in. That is where we have a part to play in this story of creation. And it's a meaningful one, right? It's not that we can change the outcome of anything. It's still, God is still sovereign over it all. But it is through the act of accepting his sovereignty that we show our love and appreciation for the story as a whole, right? It's almost like if you listen to an actor, right, talk about being in a movie and talk about their favorite performances, the performances they feel they did the best at, they'll talk about how it was an honor to play that part in the story. It's because the story was so compelling to them that they just wanted to live up to playing that part. And that is what we're left with, I think, in the Bible. If you do believe it, you're left with seeing very clearly, here's the part I'm left to play. And if I appreciate this story the way that actor appreciates the story that they're playing their part in, then I will play this part to the best of my ability. And Jesus has given us how to do so, right? And the rest of the Old Testament expands upon that. It gives us more instruction of how to use these tools that Jesus gave us. But that, as I see it anyways, and we'll get your thoughts here in a second, is in fact the grand narrative of the Bible, which of course reflects the grand narrative of all creation, which again is the story of God's relationship with his creation. It is a self-expression of God, and it is us that participating this way participates and expresses with God who he is.
Fantastic.
So
I want to raise, I have two things that I want to raise, and they both, I think, toy around. I think we've established, and I think that was a really good job of establishing to the believer that narrative structure is a good way to approach the Bible. That it is almost the right way to approach the Bible. And I'm always hesitant to use a definitive right, but I think it is borderlines on being very appropriate here to say that it's the right way to approach the Bible. I want to take a second and speak to the potentially agnostic listener, or somebody who is coming from outside the church, because I think that there's that this actually is a very good point for reason to, at minimum, want to believe what the Bible has to say, if not to completely believe it, if it not to be evidence for it. Because the first thing I would say is that and I would almost ask this to you, is that is a wonderful story, but it is just a story. It's just a narrative.
In that sense, yeah.
And so saying like, but who's to say a story is true? And so I would say this comes back to the idea that I really do believe that we perceive the deepest things and the greatest spiritual meaning from stories. It's to say that, like, you have all the trouble in the world trying to get an uninterested child to read a science textbook, but you will have him obsessing, or her obsessing, over the Avengers. And the adventures that are portrayed there. And I don't think it's just because it's engaging. I think it's because it hits at something that is deeply a part of us, that as humans, it's something that's I hesitate to say unique, but I think there's good evidence that it's unique within humanity, that we feel that we're participating in a story. And there's not necessarily a great materialistic explanation for that, I guess. If we're saying there would be a better functional explanation, and then I think there's an even deeper spiritual explanation as to why we feel that we're participating in a story.
Let me jump in there real quick and say, I think that's actually very important. Is we do all, I mean, we say all the time, right, we're the hero in our own story, and it is true, right? We do perceive that we're all participating in a story.
Or we're the anti-hero. I think.
Well, that too, yeah.
I think that could. I think there are people who embrace that identity
embrace
as
that
well.
Yes, yeah. Fundamentally, though, we're the main character, in our version of the story.
Yeah.
But I think we have to acknowledge that there are flaws with that perspective in a couple of different ways, and the biggest one is just simply the fact that clearly the story is bigger than us, because creation goes on beyond us. We will die. Yes, there was part that came before us, and we will die after. And we as individuals are not the pinnacle of this story, right? We're not the pinnacle of creation. We're not all of it. So we have to realize that if this all is a story, and our instincts are right, that we're participating in a story, then we can't be the main character, right? And this is one of the ways I look at coming to faith, right, in God and believing these things, is the acceptance of the fact that you are not the main character of this story, and this is God's story, and He is the main character, and that is what this story is. But there are many things that are, quote unquote, the God-shaped hole in our heart. And I think one of them is this sense of we're participating in a story. There is a story. There is a grand narrative to all of this. And not everyone is going to connect with that, but certainly there are some of you out there who this is something you feel and sense deeply. This look at the Bible then, look at this just once, read it from the perspective of saying, what if this is the story, and what if God is the main character, right? What if that's true? And just experience it that way, I mean, what harm is there in doing that, and then see how well that reflects the reality that you experience.
Yeah, let me present two things related to that. The first being very quick. You talking about, I think us being the main character, as being incorrect, I think is very well illustrated by not always, but the frequent existential, almost existential relief that comes to people who have children. Because I think having children removes you from the main character position in your narrative of life. Because I think being a child, you are the main character, because you're in an ideal situation, your parents are raising you, and you are the person receiving the attention from the adults to become something. But then that point at which your role transitions and you are raising something else, it's suddenly not as clear that you are the most significant individual in the universe. Right. Suddenly there's someone else, at minimum, ideally someone else competing for that, right, or in a more proper sense, probably has won that battle and is now the more significant person in the way that you're perceiving the world. And so the reorientation of having God over top of all that, it recreates everything and removes you from that prime position. The
Yes.
one other thing that I want to say, connecting to the story idea, is there was a story once presented. I think it's from Bertrand Russell. I'm not completely sure, but he once presented a very interesting, very nihilistic perspective on the world. And he said, he gave this lengthy description of life, of the universe exploding, of the planet slowly forming, of, for some reason, carbon eventually turning into animate life on Earth, and this long development of evolution, and then this amazing development of these creatures who understood things and had battles and had love and went at war and had created literature and art and civilizations. And then all of a sudden God sent a meteor and destroyed the entire thing. And that was his illustration of saying, look, this thing could all be meaningless. And I looked at that and I was just kind of like, my question to an atheist or to an agnostic would be, if you're looking at those two stories that presented, at the minimum, what do you want people to believe?
Well, sure, yeah.
I mean,
there's a pragmatic side of that for sure.
At minimum, what would you want to people to believe? And then at the more deeper level, at the deeper level, what seems to better describe the world?
Right, because we're in the realm of we've talked about the three levels of truth, right? We're in the realm of the spiritual here. This is not verifiable. It's not verifiable one way or the other, right? Yeah. And that's the thing. However, there is something that stands out in your story there, right? It's and correct me if I'm wrong. He has God send a meteor that destroys it all.
He does ultimately, but he's obviously an atheist, but he kind of has this perspective. Yeah, he does have God do it.
Okay, but that to me is very interesting, right? Because in the story, God is the main character, and therefore all meaning within the story derives from him, right? When you read a story, anything meaningful in the story matters because of how it relates to the main character. And I find it interesting that for him really to make a case for meaninglessness, you know, the opposite of meaning, he still had to rely on God. Yeah. It's almost like you can't if you're going to address the topic of meaning at all, you can't get away from God. So to make it meaningless, he had to still have God involved. He could have just said an asteroid will just by chance come along and hit it, you know, but he doesn't. And why doesn't he? Because to us, that seems so impossible, because we are so deeply embedded with the idea of meaning and the sensation that meaning is a real and true and experienced and fundamental thing that exists, that the story wouldn't have worked. He couldn't have told the story that way. He had to have God do it, because it's the only way to get humans to even really think about meaning. Yeah, because it does not make sense to us. The idea of things not having meaning, the true nihilism, it doesn't work. It doesn't work for us. We have to have God in there if you really want us to even consider meaning. And so he does it that way, which is fascinating.
That is very interesting. And I think that what's interesting, it addresses one issue of our experience with reality, that you never know when something's going to fly out of nowhere and knock you on your butt. You know, like you have no idea when, and truth be told, everyone thinks they're unique in this, but that's the experience of every human. Yeah, that's why people relate to that story.
That's called being human.
Everybody has has many moments during their life where things are going good, and then something smacks them and knocks them out over. The Bible has no shortage of incidences of that, in which whatever character is being presented at the time has something smack them on their side. I mean, truth be told, that's the whole story that's a main feature of the whole story of Job. Is you're going along and suddenly something comes in and knocks you over. And so it's like the conclusion that Bertrand Russell reaches is just that. And it's a very materialistic view of things, of things can be going along and things could be incredible, and a meteor is going to take it all out. And that is a materialist way of viewing the world. The spiritual way of viewing the world is that thing that took you out could have a deeper meaning to it.
Right. I was just going to say that
could lead to something else.
Yeah, that the power of the story of Job is what he was experiencing, and all of the pain and all of that is a massively important thing, and there's an incredible lesson to be drawn from it. And he doesn't really, within the story, because he's a character within a story, he doesn't really ever know the full impact then of those experiences, because
Agreed.
it has to do with us, right? As well as seeing the story, as well as the sort of the point that God is making in the divine. And so it's and
God's
the
only
problem
rebuke
is
there
too,
is
the problem is the idea that, well, God sends a meteor and wipes everything out and therefore it was meaningless. It's sort of, I think, actually misses the point of human experience, right? Human experience is that you do something meaningful even if the end result is something like catastrophic like that. Even if there's some unavoidable catastrophic events, it was still meaningful what you did along the way, right? To me, my example of this is Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong now is China's is absorbing it, and a lot of what was so impressive and amazing and beautiful about what Hong Kong did with a small strip of land, and built an incredible economy that bettered so many people's lives through it. That's now going away, right? But that's being wiped out by the meteor, if you will. Yet still, right, I think all of us look at that and see that happening. We see the meteor hit in real life, and we still look at it and say, yeah, but what they did was still meaningful, right? And so it speaks to me in terms of how impossible it is for us to grasp the idea of things being meaningless. Because we still look at Hong Kong, we see what we could say, really, well, what they did was meaningless because now it's all being absorbed, and going away. And we still look at it and say, no, it was still better that they did that. It was better that they didn't squander that 50 years or that time that they had. It was better. And so it's just the idea of meaningless is hard to grapple with. I think humans can't actually comprehend it. I think we're not built to even wrap our minds around the idea that, oh, this is meaningless.
Well, I think that's why it invokes such a suicidal instinct,
right?
Because self-destruction is, it hits the self-destruct button of saying you can't comprehend it.
Even that is not, but you're not still, even then, if you resort to suicide, you're still not accepting the idea that life is meaningless, right? Because what you're doing there is saying that, well, then I can create meaning, right? So you're still, in a way, saying that there has to be meaning, like meaning is unavoidable.
How so?
And so, because by then killing yourself, you've now done something meaningful, you've done something impactful, right? It has an effect, even if just on yourself, right? Suddenly there was an action you took that had meaning, and that meaning may have been destructive, right? Your idea of being the anti-hero of your story and embracing that, right? The anti-hero still believes that they're creating something meaningful, that they're doing something meaningful, and so that's, I think ultimately we cannot be divorced from the idea that meaning is a real thing, and it must exist. And that is why, again, I mean, I think even if right now, if you don't believe the Bible, if you're agnostic, atheist, whatever, you still feel a pull to meaningful, the need for meaning as well, right? And if you want to examine that, which you probably should, this sense of meaning that you feel, you probably would do best to turn to the kinds of things that people have used to answer that question over the course of millennia, right? If there are stories that say, here is the source of meaning, here is what meaning is, here is where it comes from, and it has sustained for that long, that is something worth examining. That's something that is not fluid, right? That's not something that changes like our sense of material understanding or even our sense of functional understanding. That is something that stays consistent and has demonstrated itself to stay consistent. And so it's probably worth it to go there first. And that's why I would say that the story, the narrative of the Bible that we've discussed here is a great place to go to for that kind of thing. And that is what we will be looking at in the course of this show. Is one of the things we'll be examining is this idea of, hey, this story is the source of meaning. It describes the meaning for your life, and it gives a sense of purpose because it describes where purpose comes from. It describes where your pull to purpose comes from, where this instinct from within you comes from. Mm-hmm. So, all right, with that, we will be back next week. Like I said, we've got a little bit more here to do in terms of background and a sort of approach to the Bible as a whole. It is incredibly layered and reveals the answers to mysteries we didn't even know were mysteries. So to that end, we want to give a little more background on how we're going to be thinking about the Bible as a whole, and then in time getting into verse 1. Which itself might take a couple of episodes, but we'll get there in time. So be sure to like, subscribe, follow us, comment, all those things. Email us at unschooltheology@protonmail.com.
Send us questions.
Yes, yeah. If you have any questions, send them our way. If over time,
talk about them.
Yeah, if we gather up questions that are worthy of an episode, we'll do it. Or if we get enough questions that it's a mailbag type episode.
Yeah.
Yep. Or if we didn't explain something here clear enough and we can clarify it further, we'd love to do that too. So it's one of those things where we sort of know what we're talking about, but and we're doing our best to express it to people who aren't occupying our headspace. But of course, when two people who know what they're saying are speaking to each other, sometimes they might leave something out that someone who doesn't know what they're saying needs to hear. So be sure to let us know if that's necessary.
You might know what you're saying. I don't know if I do, but
exactly. So do all that, and we will talk to you again soon. Thanks.